Our next guest is the assistant professor of history at York College of Pennsylvania. She's doing really interesting work on women's history in the American Revolution. Please welcome Dr. Jacqueline Beatty. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This should be fun.
I want to start by asking, um, women in colonial history are often pretty underrepresented. Uh, how did colonial women assert themselves?
Yeah, so women and other marginalized groups are sometimes considered to be not really present, not really participating, not really asserting themselves because of the kind of popular narrative of American history that we have that favors kind of white men in power, right? But that is only true if we take the perspective of the white men in power, right? So in this case, colonial and revolutionary era American women really asserted themselves in a range of ways. Sorry, my dog's here in the background. They asserted themselves in a range of ways, at the very least, out of necessity, right? They were there, so they're obviously going to be asserting themselves. But they also had really important social, economic, and political influence as well that I think is largely unknown by the general public. So it's actually really hard to answer that question because there are infinite numbers of ways in which colonial women asserted themselves. But I'm going to try and give you maybe a few examples that are kind of more broad to make
Great.
some broad assertions here. So one example is that women's labor, women's work is really essential to the survival and the success of their families and the state, right, and the government. This includes domestic labor, which at the time, right before modern conveniences, is physically demanding. It's time consuming and it's really difficult to manage, right? And then you
Yeah,
just have to get up and do it all
yeah,
again the next day.
yeah. It's a pre-Swiffer era.
Yes, it's pre-Swiffer, it's pre-vacuum, it's, what is the scariest to me, pre-washing machine and dryer, right? Laundry. At that point in time, you had to be really, really strong to do the laundry. So that labor is really critical. But, so is women's reproductive labor, right? A lot of families depended on the labor of their children, and giving birth to and raising children is not an easy feat. And that's white women, right? We have
Yeah,
to expand the conversation to include Black and particularly enslaved women whose labor was essential, right? In terms of political power and participation, I think we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that political power only means voting and holding elected office, right? Everything is political, so there's a ton of ways in which women in this era have political power. There's one example in particular that I think is really powerful. There was a group of women in Philadelphia during the Revolution. They called themselves the Ladies Association of Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin's daughter was one of the chairwomen of this organization, and they basically went door to door raising money for the Continental Army, right? It's pretty extraordinary the work that they did. They created this very kind of complex organizational hierarchy. They used the press to advertise and promote their efforts, and they created a model for women in other colonies and states to follow. So they ultimately raised a ton of money, which they really wanted to go to pay salaries of Continental soldiers, which were, we'll say, severely lacking at this point in time.
yeah.
But George Washington stepped in and redirected the funds to clothing that the soldiers also desperately needed, right? And they kind of, assented to his authority, right? And he kind of condescendingly suggested that these women themselves be the ones to make the shirts for the soldiers with the money that they raised. Their reception is kind of mixed. We get critics who say that it's inappropriate. Some call it absurd, the work that the women are doing, kind of going about for money, as they say. And they framed it as female patriotism, which I think is an important distinction to make, because they are creating an exception for their actions in a way that wouldn't have challenged the kind of white male hierarchy, right? that they were not doing things that were, I should say, they were doing things that were appropriate for women to do because they framed it as female patriotism. And of course, these women are wealthy, right? They have a level of privilege that enables them to do this work in a way that gave them that advantage. I think a lot of folks probably know about figures like Abigail Adams. She also had a number of friends like Mercy Otis Warren and Judith Sargent Murray. These are extraordinary women, kind of the exception, not the rule, in the way that they were very engaged politically and very much speaking out on these issues. But ordinary women really did have plenty of opportunities to participate politically as well, right? I mean, the revolution is a massive economic crisis in addition to a political one. And right, those economic issues are the ones that most people relate to and focus on. So women were really critical in the kind of economic side of the revolution. They were central figures in boycotts, in kind of the home manufacturing to make the boycotts work, in these non-importation agreements. These movements were among the most successful protests in the revolutionary era, and they wouldn't have been possible without women's assent to these activities and women's participation in these activities, right? That the revolution is full of crowd action, right? These out-of-door protests, and women were part of those crowds too, and that wasn't contingent upon class or race. So those kinds of forms of political activism are incredibly accessible. We just don't necessarily hear stories of the centrality of women's roles there too.
So you've talked a lot about power being, more of a spectrum than it's sort of a, something that people have or don't have. It is a spectrum. But what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, so I think we tend to think about and talk about power in a really absolute binary way, like either you have it or you don't. But that's not how it works. It's not how it worked throughout history. That's not how it works now. Power is expressed and asserted by degrees, right? You don't have to be the president of the United States to have power. And certainly, in our society and throughout history, there have been individuals and groups who have been more powerful than others. And it's often the case that those in power attempt to use various structures to maintain a stranglehold on that power, right? That's kind of one of the central narratives in history. So in early American society, the economy and political power was really structured around a white patriarchal system that favored elite white men, which meant that everyone else's power, which really meant that everyone else's power was contingent upon that structure, right? So elite white women's opportunities were basically limited relative to what their white male counterparts were doing. But relative to elite white women, lower income white women had more limited power, and even more limited than that was the power of Indigenous and Black women, right? That's where that spectrum is a really useful metaphor, I think, because it's much more useful to think of power that way, because you can both understand the ways in which people can express power and agency over their own lives and in society, but also recognize the massive structural limitations on the full expression of their power, right? It's neither saying that they're fully empowered to control their lives, nor saying that they're fully disempowered, right? It's marginal, it's by degrees, it's on a spectrum.
If you had to choose one thing to be the sort of the biggest misconception that people have about what life was like for women around the time of the revolution, what would you say that would be?
I think it's just the notion that colonial women were disempowered and were devoid of rights. I see this a lot from my students, that they assume that women didn't have power or rights until the 19th Amendment was passed, right? And somehow that magically transformed women's roles in society. But as I've already described, I mean, women have countless ways in which they are empowered in society and in their own lives, right? Obviously, still within an incredibly restrictive system, but that doesn't make them like inactive members of society either.
Why is women's history important?
Well, women make up, by some calculations, more than half of the population. So I think on the surface, it's important to draw attention to the majority of the population, right? But um, women's experiences are different from men's, right? So they warrant specific study, particularly because throughout history, women have been subjugated by men and purposefully written out of the narrative, right? If if women were written into the story from the beginning, we wouldn't necessarily have to do all this kind of extra work to try and reinsert women and recenter American history around women's experiences. I mean, what would you think if we kind of just erased men from history, right? That wouldn't be good either, right? But it's really important to be
Well, I'm
inclusive.
going to be on as a man. I'm going to say there's a lot of stuff. There's more stuff that it would be great to get rid of than it is to
Yeah.
keep. Uh,
Right. Okay. Well, fair argument. But yeah, I mean, we can't understand American history without knowing women's history, right? Like any other marginalized group, it's absolutely necessary to understand women's history in order to understand American history. So
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you being here, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Jacqueline Beatty.